The extended wheelbase Rolls-Royce Phantom glided smoothly through the streets of Manhattan, an imposing presence amidst the chaos of the city. Its polished black surface gleamed like a dark jewel, reflecting the city's lights as it wove through traffic with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. Inside the car, Hugh Calloway Worthington sat in the back seat, his posture relaxed yet commanding, a man who exuded control in every detail of his carefully constructed life. He gazed out of the tinted window, his expression indifferent, as his eyes swept over the restless energy of the city outside. The hurried movements of pedestrians, the crumbling storefronts, and even the occasional clusters of homeless individuals encamped on street corners blurred into a singular, uninspiring tableau. His gaze paused momentarily on a mural, its faded colors barely visible against the brick wall of a weathered building. The words scrawled across it in bold letters read, "Only when we stop valuing people by their wealth do we see the true worth in ourselves." Hugh allowed himself a brief, dry smile. The sentiment was laughable, the kind of naive optimism he had long dismissed as irrelevant in the real world. A few blocks later, his eyes flicked toward a man rifling through a trash can, his shoulders hunched beneath a filthy blanket. For a moment Hugh watched him, his amusement faint but evident. They must find some peculiar comfort in their misery, he thought, almost entertained by the irony of a world where some thrived while others merely survived. The Phantom slowed as it approached the curb in front of the Azure Roastery, an elite cafe known for its exclusivity. Its minimalist design and subtle branding were a silent nod to those who understood the price of understated luxury. Without needing to be prompted, Hugh leaned toward the intercom beside him, his tone clipped and efficient. "Frederick, the usual. Make it quick," he ordered, his focus already returning to the glowing screen of his phone. Frederick, ever the picture of professionalism, gave a silent nod and exited the car, his movements precise and purposeful. Hugh barely acknowledged his chauffeur's departure. His attention was fixed on his phone, his fingers moving deftly over the screen as he reviewed emails and sent replies. His expression was as cold and detached as the calculated business decisions that had built his empire. The luxurious silence inside the car was broken only by the soft hum of the city outside, a distant murmur that underscored his isolation from the world beyond the tinted glass. The interruption came unexpectedly. A soft, hesitant tapping on the window pulled Hugh from his thoughts. His brows furrowed in irritation as he glanced toward the source of the disturbance. With a touch of a button, the window lowered slightly, just enough for him to assess the intruder. Standing on the sidewalk was a woman, her appearance a stark contrast to the polished elegance of his surroundings. Her blonde hair was unkempt, and her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame, worn and mismatched. Despite her disheveled state, there was a peculiar intensity in her eyes, a quiet determination that held his gaze. "Sir, could you spare something?" "Anything would help," she said, her voice low and tinged with desperation. Hugh's expression hardened, his lips curling into a faint smirk that conveyed both disdain and amusement. "And why should I?" he replied, his tone cold and cutting. "What makes you deserving? Give me one good reason, just one, and make it worth my time." The woman didn't falter. Straightening her back, she looked at him with a calmness that belied her situation. Her hand rested lightly on her abdomen as she spoke, her voice steady. "Because I'm carrying a daughter," she said. "A daughter who will be born deaf." Hugh's gaze flicked briefly to her stomach, then back to her face. His expression remained unreadable, his silence heavy, as he considered her words. Without further comment, he reached into his wallet and withdrew a folded stack of bills. He extended them toward her through the narrow gap in the window, his movements deliberate. "Take this and disappear," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He released the money into her trembling hand, already reaching for the control to close the window and end the exchange. "Wait," she said suddenly, her voice louder this time. Hugh paused, his irritation evident, as he let the window remain partially open. "What now?" he snapped, his tone sharp. The woman held his gaze, her voice trembling but firm. "I just wanted to thank you and tell you my name. I'm Anais Dinora Garcia." Hugh's laugh was short and cold, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Do you think your name matters to me?" he retorted, his words laced with contempt. Anais didn't flinch. She squared her shoulders and spoke again, louder this time, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Maybe not, but I have a name, just like you. Even faces filled with hunger have names." She turned and walked away without another word, her movement slow but purposeful, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. Hugh watched her retreating figure, his gaze lingering longer than he intended. Something about her words, her presence, unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Her name echoed faintly in his mind, an unwelcome reminder of a humanity he preferred to ignore. When Frederick returned, coffee in hand, Hugh accepted it without a word, his mind unusually preoccupied. As the phantom pulled back onto the street, the bitter aroma of the drink did little to distract him. For reasons he couldn't explain, his thoughts kept returning to the brief encounter, the name Anais Dinora Garcia lingering like an unfinished sentence. "Frederick," he said suddenly, his voice sharp, "turn around. Go back to where we were." Frederick glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his expression carefully neutral. "Right away, sir." The car turned smoothly, heading back toward the spot where they had left the woman behind. Hugh leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the street ahead with an intensity that surprised even him. It didn't take long to spot her. She was standing near a food cart, holding a hot dog, and eating with slow, deliberate bites. Hugh pressed the intercom again, his voice firm. "Stop here." Frederick obeyed, pulling the car to a stop a short distance from the food cart. Hugh stepped out of the Phantom, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached her. Anais turned at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes widening in surprise. She stared at him, the man who had treated her with such cold disdain only moments ago, now standing before her again. "Don't you have any shame?" Hugh said, his tone sharp. "Eating garbage like this in your condition. I gave you money so you wouldn't have to resort to this." Anais blinked, her confusion evident. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Come with me," he said abruptly, ignoring her question. "Where?" she asked, taking a step back. "Why should I go anywhere with you?" Hugh's jaw tightened. "It's your choice," he said coolly. "But don't expect me to feel sorry for you if you choose to waste what little chance you have left." Anais hesitated, glancing between him and the luxurious car parked nearby. She took a deep breath, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "Fine," she said finally, "but only because I don't want my child to suffer." Without another word, Hugh gestured toward the car, holding the door open for her as she climbed inside. Inside the luxurious interior of the Phantom, Anais sat stiffly, her discomfort evident as she tried to adjust to her unfamiliar surroundings. The leather seats were smooth and cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the rough, unyielding textures of the street life she had known. Hugh watched her from the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable. For a while, neither of them spoke. The hum of the car engine and the muffled sounds of the city outside were the only interruptions to the silence. Anais kept her hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing toward Hugh, whose gaze was fixed straight ahead. Finally he broke the silence, his tone abrupt and direct. "How do you know your child is deaf?" Anais turned to him, startled by the question. She hesitated, her voice trembling slightly when she answered, "I got sick when I was 2 months pregnant. Rubella. The doctors said it could cause complications for the baby." She paused, her eyes growing distant as she recalled the events. "They ran tests and told me there was an 80% chance she'd be born deaf. They also mentioned other possible issues, but I didn't care. She's my baby." Hugh studied her, his gaze sharp. "And her father? Where is he in all this?" Anais's expression darkened, and she looked away, her hands tightening around the worn fabric of her coat. "He couldn't handle it," she said softly. "When the doctors told us about the risks, he wanted me to terminate the pregnancy." Her voice caught, but she forced herself to continue. "I refused. He called me crazy and said he wouldn't stick around to raise a child with disabilities." Hugh's lips tightened into a thin line. "So he abandoned you," he stated coldly, his tone devoid of sympathy. Anais nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He packed his things and left that same day. Told me I could do whatever I wanted, but he wouldn't be part of it." She looked down, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I lost my home not long after. The rent was too much to handle on my own, and, well, here I am." The weight of her story hung heavily in the air, but Hugh didn't respond immediately. His mind worked quietly, dissecting her words, her choices, and her resilience. After a moment, he leaned toward the intercom. "Frederick, head to my building." The chauffeur's voice came through clearly. "Yes, sir." Anais looked at Hugh, her brow furrowing. "Where are you taking me?" "You'll see," he replied curtly, his tone leaving no room for further questions. The car pulled up to an imposing skyscraper in the heart of the city. Its gleaming glass facade reflected the lights of the surrounding buildings, a beacon of affluence and power. Hugh stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand to Anais. She hesitated, her uncertainty plain on her face, but she accepted his assistance. Inside, the lobby was grand and intimidating, with marble floors and towering ceilings that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Anais felt out of place, her worn appearance starkly contrasting the polished luxury around her. Hugh led her to a private elevator, swiping a key card to grant access. The ride up was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the elevator. When the doors opened, they stepped into a spacious, tastefully decorated apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, but Anais barely noticed, overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding her. "This is where you'll stay," Hugh said matter-of-factly. Anais turned to him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Hugh's eyes narrowed slightly, and he crossed his arms. "I don't need anything from you, but your child, she deserves a chance. If you're not capable of giving her that, I will." Anais bristled at his words. "I can take care of my daughter. I've done everything I can to keep her safe, even if it's cost me everything." Hugh raised an eyebrow, his voice taking on a hard edge. "Living on the streets, eating scraps from a food cart, exposing yourself and your child to God knows what, you call that taking care of her?" Anais flinched, but held her ground. "I did what I had to. At least I didn't abandon her like her father did." For a moment they stared at each other, the tension between them palpable. Then Hugh sighed, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "Look, I don't care about your pride. You need help, and whether you like it or not, I'm offering it. Take it or leave it." Anais hesitated, her instincts urging her to reject his offer to protect herself from the vulnerability it would require. But she thought of her daughter, the life growing inside her, and the uncertain future that awaited them if she stayed on the streets. "Fine," she said finally, her voice low. "I'll stay, but only for her sake." Hugh nodded, satisfied. "Good. You'll find everything you need here, clothes, food, whatever. Tomorrow we'll discuss next steps." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward another room, leaving Anais standing in the middle of the lavish apartment, struggling to process the sudden turn her life had taken. As the night wore on, Anais sat by the window, gazing out at the glittering city below. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a flicker of hope. Inside the car, the contrast between Anais's worn appearance and the immaculate luxury of the Phantom was striking. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands resting protectively on her rounded belly. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine as the car pulled smoothly back into traffic. Hugh sat across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, studying her with an intensity that made her uneasy. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Anais spoke. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was hesitant, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "You don't know me, and I doubt you care about people like me. So why?" Hugh didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back, crossing one leg over the other as he regarded her with a calculating expression. "Perhaps I don't like loose ends," he said finally, his tone clipped. "Or maybe I'm just curious to see how far someone like you can go with a little help." Anais frowned, her fingers tightening around the hem of her tattered sweater. "I'm not a project for you to experiment on," she said quietly. Hugh smirked. "Good. That's exactly what I wanted to hear." The car continued to glide through the city, the buildings outside gradually giving way to quieter, more affluent streets. Anais stared out of the window, her mind racing. She couldn't understand this man, his motives, or why he had decided to take an interest in her. Part of her wanted to tell him to stop the car and let her out, to return to the fragile semblance of control she had over her life. But another part of her, the part that thought of the child growing inside her, told her to stay. Whatever his reasons, this might be her only chance to give her daughter a better future. The Phantom eventually came to a stop in front of a high-end boutique hotel. Its grand facade was illuminated by warm, golden lights, and uniformed doormen stood at attention, their polished smiles welcoming guests into an opulent sanctuary. Hugh stepped out first, his commanding presence drawing discreet glances from the staff. He turned back to Anais, extending a hand to help her out of the car. She hesitated, glancing down at her threadbare clothes, then back at the luxurious surroundings. She looked completely out of place, and she knew it. "Are you going to stand there all night?" Hugh asked impatiently, his tone sharp but not unkind. Reluctantly, she took his hand, allowing him to help her out. One of the doormen stepped forward, his expression neutral, but his eyes betraying a flicker of curiosity. Hugh addressed him with a curt nod. "We need a suite, something private, and make sure she has everything she needs. Clothes, food, medical care." The doorman nodded briskly, his professionalism intact, despite the unusual request. "Of course, sir. Right away." Hugh turned back to Anais, his expression unreadable. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Anais stared at him, unsure of what to say. Finally, she managed a quiet, "Thank you." Hugh didn't respond. Instead, he turned and strode toward the entrance, leaving her to follow behind. Inside, the lobby was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and an air of exclusivity that seemed to whisper that only the most privileged were welcome here. Anais shrank into herself, acutely aware of how every step she took seemed to echo louder than it should. The concierge greeted them with practiced politeness, but there was a hint of hesitation in his gaze as he looked at Anais. Hugh dismissed it with a glance. "Handle everything," he said curtly, handing over his black card. "Certainly, Mr. Worthington," the concierge replied smoothly, taking the card with both hands. As arrangements were made, Hugh turned to Anais. "There's something I want to know," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "How do you know your child will be deaf? It's not something you can just guess." Anais took a deep breath, her fingers nervously clutching the fabric of her sweater. "When I was 8 weeks pregnant, I contracted rubella," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "The doctors said there was a high risk, 80%, that my baby would be born deaf. They explained all the complications, all the reasons why—" She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Why what?" Hugh pressed, his tone sharper now. "Why I should end the pregnancy," Anais finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said it would be better for everyone, especially the baby." Hugh studied her, his expression unreadable. "And yet here you are," he said finally. Anais nodded, her voice gaining strength. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't give up on her, no matter what the odds were. I had to try, but my husband, he couldn't handle it. He left. He said he wouldn't raise a child who might be—" She paused, her voice breaking. "Imperfect." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Hugh's gaze didn't waver. "And you've been on the streets ever since?" "Not right away," Anais admitted. "I tried to manage on my own, but it wasn't enough. I lost my job, my home, everything. But I never lost her." She placed a protective hand on her stomach, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She's the only thing I have left." For a moment Hugh said nothing. Then he nodded, as if coming to a decision. 80%, you said?" "Yes." "Then we'll focus on the other 20, he said matter-of-factly. Anais blinked, confused. "What?" Hugh didn't elaborate. Instead, he turned to the concierge, who had just returned with the room keys. "Take her to the suite, make sure she's comfortable. And call a doctor. I want her checked out tonight." The concierge nodded, and Anais felt a hand on her arm, gently guiding her toward the elevator. She glanced back at Hugh, but he had already turned away, his attention back on his phone as if the conversation had never happened. That night, as Anais lay in a bed softer than anything she had ever known, she couldn't stop thinking about him, the man who had appeared out of nowhere and upended her life in a matter of hours. She didn't understand his motives, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to hope. The next morning, the soft light of dawn filtered through the horizon as Anais, Dinora, and Hugh found themselves once again in the back seat of a private limousine Hugh had rented for the day. The air inside was thick with unspoken questions, broken only by the muted hum of the engine. Anais shifted nervously in her seat, unable to contain the mix of curiosity and apprehension bubbling inside her. Finally, she turned to Hugh, her voice hesitant but steady. "Where are we going, Mr. Hugh?" He glanced at her, his expression calm yet unreadable, a hint of a secret behind his cool demeanor. "You'll find out soon enough, Dinora," he replied simply, his tone leaving no room for further inquiry. The limousine wove through the city streets, gliding effortlessly towards its destination. Anais stared out the window, trying to piece together the puzzle of Hugh's intentions. Minutes later, the car came to a smooth stop in front of a sleek, modern building adorned with a large, prominent sign that read, "California Center for Advanced Fetal Medicine." Her eyes widened as she read the name, her breath catching in her throat. The realization of their visit's purpose hit her like a wave, stirring a cocktail of emotions, relief, fear, and cautious hope. Hugh, ever observant, noticed the tension in her hands and reached over, giving her shoulder a reassuring pat. "This is one of the best facilities in the country," he said in a composed, almost gentle tone. "We're going to run every test possible to ensure your daughter gets the best chance at life." Anais turned to him, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She could hardly believe that someone who had been a stranger not long ago was now offering her and her unborn child a lifeline she never imagined possible. Hugh's expression remained stoic, but there was a faint flicker of something softer in his gaze, something that hinted at a deeper motivation. The staff at the center welcomed them with professionalism and efficiency, ushering them into a private waiting area while the necessary arrangements were made. Before long, they were seated in a consultation room with Dr. Samuel Eckhart, a middle-aged specialist with a calm, measured demeanor. "Ms. Gonzalez," Dr. Eckhart began, addressing Anais with a warm smile, "can you tell me when you contracted rubella during your pregnancy?" Anais took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly. "It was around 8 weeks," she said, her hands instinctively moving to her belly. The doctor nodded, making notes on his tablet. "Have you experienced any other health complications since then?" "No," Anais replied. "It's been difficult. but overall everything has been stable." Dr. Eckhart offered another reassuring smile before continuing. "We're going to conduct a series of advanced 3D and 4D ultrasounds, as well as genetic testing through amniotic fluid samples. These will give us a detailed view of your baby's development, including her auditory system. Depending on the results, we'll evaluate the treatment options available to address any complications." Before Anais could fully process his words, Hugh spoke, his voice firm and authoritative. "Dr. Eckhart, spare no expense. Use the best technology and resources available. I want to know everything about this child's condition and what can be done to help her." The doctor nodded, sensing the gravity in Hugh's tone. "Of course, Mr. Worthington." Anais turned to Hugh, her voice quivering with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Hugh," she said softly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Hugh's gaze remained steady, though his expression softened slightly. "There is a way," he murmured, his voice trailing off. Anais blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "You'll understand when the time comes," Hugh replied cryptically, turning his attention back to the doctor. Dr. Eckhart guided them to a state-of-the-art examination room where Anais lay down on a cushioned table. The hum of the equipment filled the room as a team of specialists began the intricate tests. Anais watched the images of her baby flicker on the screens, a mix of awe and fear tightening her chest. Hugh stood nearby, his gaze fixed on the monitors, his usual composure betrayed by the tension in his jaw. Over the next several weeks, their lives became a cycle of consultations, tests, and waiting. Every result was a small victory or a reminder of the uncertainties they faced. Though Hugh and Anais rarely spoke of their emotions, their shared mission created a quiet bond between them. During a pivotal consultation, Dr. Eckhart addressed them with a cautious expression, holding a report in his hands. "Mr. Worthington, Ms. Gonzalez," he began, "the fetal MRI indicates a potential anomaly in the development of your daughter's auditory nerve. If the nerve doesn't develop further, it may not be functional. In such a case, a cochlear implant would not be an option." Anais felt the weight of his words crush her, and tears pricked her eyes as she clutched the armrest of her chair. Hugh leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Is there anything we can do? Any possibility this can change?" Dr. Eckhart met Hugh's intense gaze, his own voice calm but empathetic. "We need to wait and monitor her progress. It's possible the nerve could develop in the coming weeks, but for now, patience is essential." The days that followed were filled with quiet determination. Hugh and Anais shared moments of unspoken understanding, their resolve uniting them in ways neither had anticipated. Weeks later, during a follow-up appointment, Dr. Eckhart greeted them with a smile that immediately lifted the tension in the room. "Good news," he announced. "The auditory nerve is present and continues to develop. While it's progressing more slowly than usual, there's a strong possibility it will be functional. Once your daughter is born, we can evaluate her for a cochlear implant." Anais exhaled deeply, her relief evident as tears rolled down her cheeks. Hugh allowed a small, rare smile to curve his lips. "Then we move forward," he said simply, his tone resolute. That evening, as they sat in the hotel restaurant, Anais looked at Hugh with gratitude shining in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future, not just for her child, but for herself as well. The soft lighting of the restaurant cast a warm glow over the room, reflecting off the crystal glassware and polished silver. Anais sat across from Hugh at a table near the window, where the view overlooked the resort's meticulously maintained gardens. The scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers wafted faintly through the slightly open glass, mingling with the aroma of their meal. For a while they ate in companionable silence, but it was clear that both had thoughts weighing heavily on their minds. Anais glanced at Hugh, whose sharp features were illuminated by the flickering candlelight. His expression was unreadable, as it so often was, but she had come to sense when he was deep in thought. Finally, unable to hold back her curiosity, she asked, "Mr. Hugh, why are you doing all of this? For me and my daughter?" Hugh set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, considering her question. His eyes met hers, and for a moment his usual guarded demeanor seemed to soften. "Let's just say I've been given more than most people could ever dream of," he said slowly. "And I've spent my life using it to build walls around myself. Maybe it's time I did something different, something meaningful." Anais studied him, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite define. She wanted to press further, to understand the man who had so abruptly entered her life and turned it upside down, but she sensed that he had already shared more than he was accustomed to. As the evening wore on, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. Hugh found himself chuckling at Anaïs's candid descriptions of the people she had met during her years of struggle, while she was surprised by his dry wit and the occasional glimmer of humor that peeked through his otherwise serious demeanor. By the time they left the restaurant, the tension of the day had melted away, replaced by a tentative ease between them. The following morning, Hugh informed Anais that they would be returning to Los Angeles. She nodded, trying to hide her apprehension. "What happens next?" she asked as they stood in the hotel lobby, waiting for the limousine to arrive. Hugh turned to her, his gaze steady. "You'll stay with me. It'll be easier to manage everything from there, especially with the follow-up care your daughter will need after she's born." Anais hesitated. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," Hugh interrupted firmly. "This isn't charity, Denora. It's a commitment I've made, to you and to her." The sincerity in his voice left Anais momentarily speechless. She nodded, her trust in him growing despite the lingering mystery of his motives. Later that day, as they boarded Hugh's private jet, Anais couldn't help but marvel at the luxury surrounding her. The plush seats, the gleaming wood paneling, and the quiet hum of the engines were a stark contrast to the life she had known. Hugh, seated across from her, seemed perfectly at ease as he reviewed some documents. "Do you ever get used to this?" she asked, gesturing around the cabin. Hugh looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You'd be surprised how quickly it becomes ordinary." Anais shook her head. "I don't think I could ever take something like this for granted." He regarded her thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why you're the right person to experience it." The flight was smooth and uneventful, and by the time they landed in Los Angeles, Anais felt a strange sense of calm, as if the city's sprawling skyline held a promise of new beginnings. Frederick was waiting for them on the tarmac, his posture as impeccable as ever. He opened the limousine door for them with a respectful nod, and they were soon on their way to Hugh's estate. When the gates of the mansion swung open, Anais couldn't hide her awe. The sprawling property was like something out of a dream, with its manicured lawns, elegant fountains, and the grand facade of the house itself. It was a place that seemed almost otherworldly, yet here she was, about to step into it. Hugh led her inside, where the cool air of the marble-floored entryway greeted them. A housekeeper approached, her expression kind but professional, and Hugh introduced her to Anais. "This is Mrs. Rowe," he said. "She'll make sure you're comfortable and help with anything you need." Mrs. Rowe gave Anais a warm smile. "It's lovely to meet you, Miss Gonzalez. Mr. Worthington has already informed us of your stay, and everything has been prepared for you." Anais thanked her, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the hospitality. Hugh gestured for her to follow him, leading her up a sweeping staircase to a guest suite. The room was spacious and beautifully decorated, with soft, neutral tones and large windows that overlooked the garden. "This will be your room," Hugh said, his tone matter-of-fact. "If there is anything missing, just let Mrs. Rowe know." Anais ran her fingers over the edge of the bed's plush comforter, marveling at the contrast between this and the harsh reality of the street she had known not long ago. "It's perfect," she said quietly. "Thank you." Hugh nodded, lingering in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Rest for a while. We'll talk more later." As the door closed behind him, Anais sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She felt a mix of gratitude and disbelief, wondering how her life had shifted so drastically in such a short time. Yet, despite the uncertainty, a small, fragile hope began to take root in her heart. As the afternoon sun bathed the mansion in a golden glow, Anais found herself wandering through the expansive gardens behind the house. Every detail of the landscape seemed meticulously curated, from the perfectly trimmed hedges to the vibrant bursts of color from the flower beds. She paused near a fountain, the soft trickling of water providing a soothing background melody. For the first time in years, her heart felt lighter, though she still struggled to reconcile this newfound peace with the harsh realities she had endured. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Hugh walking toward her, his hands in his pockets, and an unusually relaxed expression on his face. He stopped a few steps away, studying her for a moment before speaking. "You seem lost in thought," he remarked, his tone lighter than usual. Anais smiled faintly. "It's hard not to be in a place like this. It feels surreal." Hugh nodded, glancing around the garden. "It's meant to. I designed it to be a retreat, a place to escape from everything." "Does it work?" Anais asked, her gaze steady. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Sometimes." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Hugh spoke again, his voice more serious. "There's something I need to discuss with you." Anais tensed slightly, her mind racing with possibilities. "What is it?" Hugh gestured for her to follow him, and they walked together toward a shaded seating area near the edge of the garden. Once they were seated, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he chose his words carefully. "I've been thinking about the future," he began, his tone deliberate, "about what happens after your daughter is born." Anaïs's heart skipped a beat. "You've already done so much for us, Hugh. I don't want to ask for more." He held up a hand, silencing her gently. "This isn't about what you're asking for, Dinora. It's about what I want to offer." She tilted her head, confused. "What do you mean?" Hugh exhaled, his gaze fixed on the ground. "You and your daughter deserve stability, a real chance at a better life. I can provide that. But I also know it's not just about money or resources. It's about trust and—" He hesitated, as if the next words were difficult to say. "Family." Anaïs's breath caught in her throat. "Are you saying—" "I want you to stay," he said firmly, meeting her eyes. "Not as a guest or a burden, but as part of something more permanent. I want to be there for your daughter, not just as someone who helps from a distance, but as someone who takes responsibility. For both of you." Her eyes widened, her emotions swirling in a chaotic mix of gratitude, disbelief, and something she dared not name. "Hugh, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet," he replied quickly. "Think about it. Take your time. But know that my offer stands no matter what." Anais nodded, her mind too overwhelmed to form a coherent response. She looked away, her gaze settling on the horizon as she tried to process his words. Hugh remained silent beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Over the next few days, Anais adjusted to life in the mansion. She found herself drawn to the library, a vast room filled with towering shelves and the comforting scent of old books. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in stories and ideas, while the reality of her situation settled into something resembling normalcy. Hugh, meanwhile, maintained his usual busy schedule, often retreating to his home office for long stretches of time. Yet, despite his apparent preoccupation, he always seemed to find moments to check in on Anais. Whether it was a quiet dinner together or a brief conversation in passing, he made it clear that she was not just a temporary fixture in his life. One evening, as they sat in the study sipping tea, Anais finally broached the topic that had been weighing on her mind. "Hugh," she began hesitantly, "why did you decide to help me?" "Really? I know you've said it's about making a difference, but it feels like there's more to it." Hugh set down his cup, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he admitted. "There is more to it, but it's not something I've talked about in a long time." Anais waited patiently, sensing that he needed space to gather his thoughts. "When I was younger, I made a lot of mistakes," he said slowly. "I was reckless, selfish, and I hurt people who didn't deserve it. One of them was a woman I cared about deeply. She wanted a family, but I wasn't ready. I pushed her away, and by the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late." He paused, his jaw tightening as he fought to maintain his composure. "Helping your daughter. It feels like a chance to do something right, to make up for the ways I've failed in the past." Anais reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You've done more than enough, Hugh. You don't have to carry that guilt forever." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Maybe not, but I still want to try." Their conversation lingered in Anaïs's mind long after Hugh left the room. For the first time, she began to see beyond the layers of wealth and power that surrounded him, glimpsing the man beneath, the man who was trying, in his own way, to heal. Weeks turned into months, and as Anaïs's due date approached, the mansion buzzed with quiet anticipation. Hugh took an increasingly active role in preparing for the baby's arrival, from consulting with pediatric specialists to overseeing the setup of a nursery. His dedication was unwavering, and Anais couldn't help but feel a growing sense of security in his presence. When the day finally came, the delivery was smooth, and the cries of a healthy baby girl filled the room. Anais wept with relief as she held her daughter for the first time, marveling at the tiny, perfect life she had fought so hard to protect. Hugh stood nearby, his usually stoic expression softened by the sight of the newborn. "She's perfect," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Anais looked up at him, her tears glistening in the soft light. "She wouldn't be here without you." Hugh shook his head. "She's here because of you, Denora. You never gave up on her." In that moment, something shifted between them, a silent understanding that their lives were now irrevocably intertwined. As the days passed, the mansion brimmed with new energy. Anais and Hugh fell into an unexpected rhythm, caring for the baby together. Hugh, once detached and calculating, now softened in the presence of the little girl who had been named Denora after his grandmother, a tribute to the legacy he sought to honor. One evening, as Anais rocked the baby to sleep in the nursery, Hugh appeared at the door. He stood there for a moment, watching the tender scene, before stepping inside. "Anais," he said, his voice steady yet vulnerable, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we've built here. I want this, us, to be permanent. Will you marry me?" Anais looked up, her heart racing as she met his gaze. In his eyes she saw sincerity, hope, and a promise of the life she had only dreamed of. "Yes," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. They embraced, the baby nestled between them, a symbol of the future they were about to create. Together they had found redemption, healing, and a love that transcended the wounds of their past. And so their story began anew, not as individuals bound by circumstance, but as a family united by choice, hope, and the belief that even the most fractured hearts could find wholeness again. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support our journey. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.